today's video, we're going to pick apart that protest by Renault against the Racing Points following yesterday's Styrian Grand Prix. Why did it happen? Why did it happen yesterday? What's it all about? And potentially what could be the impacts of this kind of thing? So let's get into it. After the race yesterday, where a race, let's not forget, where two Racing Points finished ahead of where Renault finished with their one Daniel Ricciardo car in the race. That's the first point. Why did it happen yesterday? The protest came from Renault yesterday. The skeptic tells me that it came because the two Racing Points finished ahead of them, which in the first race they didn't. Thereby, if the protest goes against Racing Point and they're excluded from the results, Renault stand to gain more yesterday than they would have done had they done it at the very first race. That's the first point. But what is the protest? Well, it comes off the back of this whole talk since pre-season testing that the Racing Point, the RP20, is seemingly almost an exact replica of last year's W10, the Mercedes from 2019. And the protest that went in alleges that the Racing Point breaches some of the sporting regulations, specifically Article 2.1, Article 3.2, and then a couple of paragraphs of Appendix 6 at the end. I'll tell you what they are in a moment. Firstly, though, the stewards last night in Austria deemed that that protest was admissible, and therefore they will investigate it fully and go through the due process. So that's the first thing. Article 2.1 and 3.2 essentially just mean that you have to have a safe car at all times and that you have to comply with the sporting and technical regulations at all times. Now those are cover-all regulations, of course. The most interesting one is Appendix 6, which is right at the end of the sporting regs. They talk specifically about the listed parts in Formula 1. Now those are the components that there's some parts that you have to design yourself and others that you can buy in from other competitors. The listed parts are things that you have to either have designed and manufactured yourself, or if you want to outsource them, and this is the key part here, Appendix 6, paragraph 2b, says that if you're going to outsource the design and manufacture of these listed components, that third party that you outsource to shall not be a competitor. So the point is that with certain components, you cannot go to another competitor in Formula 1 to buy those parts. Obviously you can do that with things like power units, with gearboxes, with various suspension elements and things like that. Aerodynamic services, brake ducts, you specifically cannot do that. So Haas, for example, go to outside suppliers for much of their car. Even the chassis is not designed by them, it's designed by Dallara in Italy. But that's fine because Dallara are not a competitor in the Formula 1 World Championship. This protest, and they've picked on brake ducts, the Renault protest on the Racing Point car. I think they've picked brake ducts because they're a fairly simple component that everyone can see. They can't protest the entire car, even though they may feel like a huge part of that car is actually copied from the Mercedes. They focused on brake ducts for this particular protest, otherwise it would have taken forever and the process would be huge. Brake ducts are one of the listed components in Formula 1, therefore you cannot buy them from another team. You used to be able to, but you can't this year. Are they a copy? Well, let's take a look at them. This is what they look like. Now, just looking at that image, you can clearly see they are, well, let's say very, very similar. And actually, what the FIA have done throughout this entire process is work with Racing Point, at Racing Point's request, to make sure that the process they've gone through is, in the FIA's opinion, satisfactory and legal. So, in that sense, why on earth would Renault deem a protest worthy when the FIA have been across this all the way through? A little bit like the DAS protest in the first round, where Mercedes had worked with the FIA to develop that system, yet Red Bull still protested it. Well, actually, it's all about getting clarification on the ruling. You look at the image, you can say, well, that looks exactly the same. To the naked eye, that looks exactly the same. Are the measurements exactly the same? I mean, they look so similar. They're not going to be exact, but they look very, very similar. So how does one team end up with an almost direct copy of the other team. And there's two elements to this protest. Did Mercedes share design data and drawings with Racing Point, which would be a clear breach of the regulations? And for that reason, I'm going to say no, they didn't do that. It would make no sense for either team to enter into that kind of relationship knowing that it's strictly illegal. It would certainly make no sense for Mercedes in their position to help out a midfield team with very little to gain themselves from that. So I don't think that's an issue at all. However, there are many other methods that teams can use to arrive at the same solution. It's photographs. I mean, if you can get that kind of detailed photo that you've just seen there, so can a team. And there are methods, things like photogrammetry, where software programs will take a detailed photograph and actually, using the software program, take measurements from that photograph to produce some kind of fairly detailed technical representation of the photo with measurements and to scale. So there's all sorts of ways to do that. Is that illegal? Well, Racing Point can say, they have said that they can prove to the FIA and have shown to the FIA, and the FIA are happy, the design data, the design process was all Racing Point. Yes, it was heavily inspired. Yes, it may have been led by things like photographs. So why would there be a protest if all of that is deemed okay by the FIA? And this is where I think it gets really quite interesting, because this is I think, a much bigger, perhaps a much bigger existential question than just about satisfying the F1's sporting regs. There's perhaps a sort of intellectual property question here, which centres more around law, and it would probably be UK law, given that both teams are UK based. Does the UK law deem that Racing Point car is a Racing Point design, or is the intellectual property so similar to Mercedes, it must be Mercedes' intellectual property? It must have been their original design. I think that's where this is going to potentially end up going. And I saw a really interesting tweet from Sam Collins yesterday, who said that back in 1978, and I can't actually corroborate this, but it's really interesting, and I totally trust Sam, that in 1978 there is a precedent for this in UK law between two Formula One teams back in the day where a similar thing occurred, and the UK law, the court, fell on the side of suggesting that one car was copied from another car. It was more than 70% the same as the car that it was allegedly copied from, and therefore over 70%, that precedent stands as being essentially the intellectual property of the original design. Now, if we fall back to that precedent, and if this goes to a UK law judgment, well, looking at those photos, is that brake duct, and it's the same at the rear, we've got that's the other part that was protest, is it 70% or more the Mercedes design? If it is, perhaps UK law could trump the sporting regulations and prove that the components are not designed, these listed parts are not designed predominantly by Racing Point themselves, and therefore would then not comply with the sporting regulations. So hugely complicated, hugely complex, very Formula One, but I think the ramifications, or the potential ramifications for this, are huge. The reason that Renault want to protest them, and other teams feel the same way, is that this could actually shape the future of our sport. Because if a team like Renault, spending a huge amount of money to try and be competitive in Formula One, where they're designing and manufacturing all of their own stuff to suit the regulations to be competitive, if a team like Racing Point or Haas or anyone else can come along on a vastly reduced budget, if they can copy the leading design from another team and all of a sudden jump themselves up into the top three in the championship on a smaller budget than a team like Renault's able to do, is that fair? Is it the Formula One that we want the future to look like? Because if that is the case, why wouldn't all of the midfield teams switch to that model? And why wouldn't we end up with a midfield that all looks like the fastest car from the previous season? These are all valid questions that need answering. I think it's a really interesting case, much more interesting than it first appears. I think, yes, the leading teams, and actually the philosophy behind most successful teams in Formula One has always been, Formula One's about making and designing and manufacturing your own components to the very best of your ability, looking for loopholes, looking for ways to maximise what the regulations allow you to do. And actually, there's a really good argument to say that the McLarens of this world, the Renaults, that's what they've always done, that's what they would love to continue doing. But if it means spending hundreds of millions of dollars and a team can spend half of that and be more competitive than you, If you then go to your board of directors and ask for the next couple of $100 million for the following season, are they going to go, well, hang on, we gave you $150 million last season and, you know, you were outpaced by this other team. Why aren't we looking at that business model? So I do think it's fascinating. I think it's going to be one that's going to rumble on. They have requested, as part of this process, as part of the response to the protest, the Mercedes W10 brake ducts from last year. Obviously Mercedes don't have those with them in Austria because they're from last year's car, so they're going to have to get those from the UK out to, presumably to Budapest, where the technical delegates at the FIA will be able to assess the components from last year's Mercedes with the brake ducts that they've impounded from this year's Racing Point, and they'll compare the two and they'll look at exactly the process they have to go to find the result here, which I don't think is going to be a fast process. Racing Point will be able to continue racing while this is going on. They're not prohibited, they've not been found guilty of anything, so they will be able to use another set of brake ducts that aren't being impounded by the FIA, if they've still got them at that point, to race in Budapest. But I think it's going to be fascinating, and I think everybody's going to be watching this very, very closely, because I think the decision either way could have some fairly significant impacts on the way Formula One looks a few years from now.